Welcome everyone to our webinar today titled Selecting Collections Management System, Know Your Options. My name is Emmanuel and I'm the Business Development Team leader here at Lucidea. So at Lucidea, we work with museums, archives, and libraries and other information professionals to provide better access and visibility to your collections, enabling your diverse audience to access and engage with your collections. So I'll be moderating the webinar today as stated on the slide, and presenting today will be Margot Note. And before we start though, I would like to go over a few housekeeping items. Number one, to make sure we get as much value from this webinar in a short period of time with Margot, our lines are muted at this moment. Secondly, we encourage you to go to the question and answer widget and type your questions so that we can address them later on. And lastly, for those of you who may want to revisit this webinar again, rest assured, our recording of this webinar will be posted at lucidea.com. So be sure to check that out if you want to go back to this webinar. First, a few words about our company, Lucidea. We are a relatively new knowledge management company focusing on bringing you the best solutions from around the world. So we are comprised of a series of products and companies that have joined Lucidea over the last 30 years. So these brands you may have heard of are Argus, Sydney, InMagic, Archivera, Eloquent, and Quadra Stars. I would like to talk to you a little bit about our presenter, Margot Note. Margot Note has over 20 years of experience in information work in the national and international sectors. She is also an author, a certified archivist, a certified records manager, an information governance professional, and project management professional. So her credentials obviously speaks volumes and for themselves. And as I mentioned, she is also an author. So there is a book that she recently wrote. It's called The Archivist Advantage, Choosing the Right Collections Management System. It is now available. As you can see, there is a link that you can go to download courtesy of Lucidea Press. I'm very excited about this book. It's very educational and informative. And we always also bring you up to speed to what we are publishing or our new materials like this to our blog post. So make sure to go to our blog post as well and subscribe. And yeah, you can also download and get a hard copy. Margot, it's really nice to have you with us today, and it's an honor to work with you. We're looking forward for today's session, and I'll pass it on to you, Margot.
Thank you so much. So it's been really fun to talk about collection management systems, and specifically this webinar where we're talking about what we should be doing to select a collection management system that makes sense. So in previous webinars, I had talked about building a project team and a selection committee and getting requirements and really thinking about what you want to get out of a system. And it's always smart to start with your requirements, and then you can seek out these systems that would be a good fit, rather than sometimes I see people reaching out to the solutions first and then working backwards to try to make that database or that solution work for your organization. So it's much better to have the requirements and move forward to make that selection. So as you're doing that, you want to do some further research about what your options could be. So of course, during this period, you're keeping abreast of best practices and you're staying current. You want to really consolidate all the information that you've gotten from talking to your stakeholders about their kind of the information gathering results that you've gotten from them and their requirements for the system. And once you have that information, you can start to refine the focus of what you're looking for and identify some of the top CMS options for you. So I think even in this early stage, there might be, purely based on the requirements and the work that you've already done, you might see possible solutions that just won't work at all. So it's good to kind of get them out of the way, and then you have a narrower scope of what you should be focused on. So this is when you can step back and do a little bit of an assessment of your organization, because you want to make sure that you get a solution that fits your organization and how it works and the people that are going to use it. So first off, you want to look at your staff abilities and be really honest about yourself about what people's skill levels are and capabilities. So for example, if you're possibly considering a CMS that requires a lot of programming or a lot of tech skills, and your staff doesn't already have that skill level, there's going to be a disconnect about how successful this solution might be. So you want to make sure that you're really aware of what people's abilities are on your staff. You're also looking at your institution's resources. So that means, of course, the costs, the money that they're willing to give for this solution or invest in kind of the work around getting this solution, but also thinking about um, does it fit your institution? Do you have people that are making decisions about whatever database or solution you're looking for? Are they more of a tech person? Are they willing to invest more money? Or are they more risk adverse? So you want to make sure that you're kind of thinking about your institution as a whole. Of course, you're thinking about the technological capabilities of the organization. So the staff members' level of comfort, but also hardware, software. If you have things like, do you have an IT staff like on location, or is it you have an IT person that's maybe a consultant? Do you totally outsource your IT? That's important to keep in mind too, to make sure the solution matches your organization. And then you're going to have to ask some questions about proprietary systems or open source, and I'll talk through some of those pros and cons. So open source, is a great solution if it matches your organization. But I do have to say that because it's free, it doesn't mean it's really free. So I always talk about, and people have used this phrase a lot, free kittens versus free beer. So free kittens, you can get a free kitten, but then you have to pay for shots and flea medication and food. So there is some cost in maintaining this cat versus free beer, which you can consume really for free. So open source, you have to consider the maintenance and training costs that are sometimes hidden when thinking about these solutions. Also the labor costs. So what does it mean to set up this open source system? Do you have the capabilities? Sometimes you have to rely on external support, and this can be somewhat chancy, because it might be you're working with a programmer or a single person or a small consulting firm, but they might give you good service. They might, it's really hard to tell. And I think sometimes when people think about commercial systems, they talk about like locked into a vendor, which is true. I mean, I'm not going to take away from that, but sometimes with open source, you're locked into a programmer, a person, and that may or may not be a good thing in the long term. Another solution that I've seen, that I've worked with clients that have a custom built system, but of course the cost of building a system is going to be much more expensive than the cost of a proprietary product, just because you're doing everything from the beginning. The organization is the first to use the system, and they can discover the bugs. You have to really figure out, is the work that you're doing so unique that you must have a custom built system? I would argue most archives, no matter how they're made up or what they're collecting, there's such an overlap of maybe 80% to 90% of the work that they're doing is going to look the same across different organizations. And then there's going to be this very unique work or requirements of that specific organization. So a custom built system doesn't necessarily make sense. I think a lot of times it's unnecessary. I found that this has happened sometimes with when people who are non-archivists, let's say people that are at the executive level, they decide, okay, we have to do something about our information, we have to get a database. I think sometimes they're not even aware that all these products exist, open source, proprietary, that are the great solutions that they're looking for. And so they move forward with a custom built solution that just is not viable in the very long term. It might work when you first create it, but I've seen in my practice that a database or a system that was built, 5 or 10 years ago, over time it becomes less useful and it's harder to change. And so you're kind of locked into this solution as well. So proprietary systems seem expensive, so I'm not going to sugarcoat that at all. I think they do cost money, but I would argue that in some ways open source or customized systems are more expensive in the long term. The thing about proprietary systems that works in our favor is that the improvements are based on the users, and it brings the accumulated experience of all the institutions that have worked before. So not only is the solution coming to you, but you have you're also in a community of a whole bunch of like-minded people that are advocating for your specific needs as well, and that have also maybe discovered bugs that have already been fixed. So you're kind of building upon all this knowledge. Um, Proprietary systems vendors can offer technical support and training. If you have something that's kind of unique to your organization, there could be some configurations to the system. Let's say you can perhaps change field names or have another tab or a table devoted to whatever thing that you're doing is very unique that's not already in the system. And proprietary systems, commercial vendors, uh, I feel ensure that the functionalities meet the needs and stay current. So you have to think an organization that is in a capitalist system has some pressure on it. So it's a pressure from the users because they want to make us happy. And then there's also pressure from their competition. So they have to keep current to keep the clients, to get more clients. So that's a good pressure cooker to really help commercial systems really be viable in the very long term. So once you've thought about that, it's good to share experiences, to talk to colleagues, to see if perhaps you know someone who's gone through this process and maybe they're a year or two ahead of you, or maybe they're already implemented the system and they're learning it. So you can really get information from those people. And you most importantly, you want to look at whatever specific solutions that they have. Did they find that the benefits of the system went beyond the requirements? So perhaps they were surprised by they were able to do something with the system that they hadn't thought about before. Kind of that um, all that information that is kind of beyond like the sales pitch. It's really the practitioners of systems. It's really important to get a sense of what people are doing and what they're excited about. So you can use that knowledge for your own method of selecting. So you want to do a lot of exploring. So you want to see how the system works in real life, online and in person. So maybe, in person sometimes is difficult these times. But if you're looking for specific systems, you can see online. If you know organizations have a system, you can see how the system works online. What is your user experience on the front end? You can tap into listservs and user groups to really get a sense of the questions that people have, how people are using the systems. Current users are really good at giving unbiased reviews. So you'll know like, okay, this part of the system is a little wonky. Accessioning needs a little work, for example, but creating a finding aid is really perfect. And maybe you figured out a solution or a tweak by looking at these listservs to make it even better. You're also looking at demonstrations. So they can be formal demonstrations, which I'll talk about in later slides, but there's also informal demonstrations. So especially now, the fact that everyone is attending virtual conferences, there are opportunities. There's still like an expo hall wherever the online conference is happening. And so you can talk to vendors, see a quick demo, and there's not like that pressure of a formal demonstration. You're just curious and stopping by. And it's a nice way just to kind of taste and kind of have a sampler platter of different solutions that you can look into. So I always encourage that too. So description, I think, is really important with collection management systems, and you want to make sure that whatever system that you select really works with the way that you describe your materials. So you want to make sure, of course, that it supports descriptive metadata authoring and encoding. You want to make sure that the software is compliant with your metadata schema, and then it complies with standards as well. And then it also provides flexible support. So a lot of times, of course, as collections are described, their series, their sub-series, you want to make sure that you're not kind of finagling the system to match the way that you've organized the paper files or the digital files. You want to make sure that there's that sense of the description really matches your collections without a lot of workarounds, obviously. So this is also an opportunity to change for the better. So maybe I'm an internal optimist, but I believe whenever an organization does a big change where you're changing systems, you're changing a new way of doing things, you're no longer doing this service or you're starting this service, that kind of change has a certain amount of momentum. So you can use this opportunity to really revisit the documentation that you've done previously about workflows of processing and all the information that you have. You can look at procedures and standards and really see if there's opportunities for improvement and take advantage of this major change. So because you're using a new system, you can kind of shoehorn perhaps new ways of doing things into the system and blame it on the system. So if you really want to do something or you want to make an improvement and your workflows or how people organize information, having it kind of baked into that database that you choose, people already know that they're making a big change. I think it's just one way to build on that and really get a lot of momentum for improvement. So you also want to think about the future. So you're obviously thinking about a solution that's going to work right now, but you have to think, and as archivists, I think we have a kind of unique sense of time. We look into the past and we look into the future. So we want to see the solution that works today, is it going to work 5 years from now, 10 years from now, 15 years from now? So you want to think beyond replicating the current system. You don't want to get perhaps the exact match to what you already have if you have a legacy system. You want to think about, what is the organization going to need later? What are the problems that need to be resolved? Think about, okay, if we double what we acquire, how will that, or if we go more into digital and less into paper files, what is that going to look like in the future? And how is this solution going to fit that? So you want to be able to adapt to the future and really add value and think about kind of new possibilities of doing things. Developing relationships is important. So especially if you're looking for a vendor or a programmer, you want to think about opportunities to build partnerships and share knowledge. You're looking for a partner who understands your needs, and this is life advice as well. So you want to make sure that whoever you partner with, this is someone that understands you, that you can work with, that can help you to move forward with your vision with the system. For any opportunities that you have that are collaborations or consortiums of, like, archives in a certain region, you want to designate a liaison between you and the service provider. And that way the information flows between the two, and then that liaison can flow that information to the larger group. That way that information has a steady communication flow, and there's less opportunities for miscommunication. And you, of course, want to communicate effectively with the team, keep them updated, make sure that their needs are being met and their questions are being answered. So when you're thinking about a vendor specifically, you want to have some background questions. So you want to see, is this vendor well established? How long have they been in business? How well do they understand your needs? And, do they have experience in your kind of collection type and size? So for example, you might have an art collection or primarily visual collection, and it's perhaps more art history based. But if you're going with a solution that, let's say, works with maps or natural history or music, for example, like some type of AV solution, there might be a mismatch. They might be able to help you, but there might be another vendor that's more a fit of what you're used to working with. Just something to consider. You want to think about how many other implementations have they performed, who are their clients, what can the client share about the system specifically and the support that they give? I mean, part of the reason that you're working with a vendor is that support. So what's that customer service opportunities look like? What's the vendor's approach to service? Do you feel that they, do they feel like they've been well taken care of? There's cost questions, of course. Always comes down to costs in all organizations, especially in archives. But we really want to think about the total costs. So what are the implementation costs of the system? Are there annual fees, support costs? Are there additional costs for servers and upgrading? Is there things that we're perhaps not thinking of or not aware of that maybe at the initial buying of the system we don't think about, but over time is going to be costly? So we really want to get a sense of what the thing is going to cost over time. So other costs to consider: software installation, additional hardware, any type of modifications that you ask for the system, data migration from legacy systems, or for perhaps, spreadsheets or other record keeping programs that you have. What's the troubleshooting going to cost? Are there system maintenance and upgrades or updates? So I think, the other thing that I should say too is that the decision makers in your organization are probably going to think about the fiscal year alone. They're really focused on the budget and spending. And I think it's important from an archival perspective to know that, okay, maybe that initial investment that first year is going to be costly, but how cost efficient is it over time? There's a longer window of costs to think about and to consider, and over time, would that make sense? But I do think, a lot of people just purely think in the fiscal year, whereas archivists, we're thinking very long term. So we definitely want to have a system that plays well with others. So it should interact well with other systems, especially if you have one system for whatever, or systems that are doing other parts of the work that you do. And if those systems aren't changing, you obviously have to find a solution that will work with that system. So you want to make sure that there's hardware with inclusive support and integration options. You want to make sure that information is not being siloed in different systems if possible. You want to share system requirements with the IT staff, and the vendor and the staff should have, IT staff should have some type of technical vetting process and a systems integration discussion. So thinking about, okay, if we take on this system, how is it going to work with these other systems it needs to work with, and what is that going to look like, and what do we need to do? Because a lot of times systems exist by themselves, but they sometimes interact with other systems as well. So once you have a sense of costs and kind of initial estimates of what you're looking at, you want to start to contact vendors with your needs and do get a sense of what those costs are. I always suggest adding contingency about 10%, because you just never know what comes up, and money has a way of spending itself. So that's just being mindful of that. You want to present the figures and the plan to your decision makers, and think about how funding will be available, and then that helps getting a real sense of what people are willing to pay and what they're willing to pay for, I think helps narrow the selection. Now, I should say too that once you have these estimations, I think it's helpful for these decision makers to get a sense of like what the range of costs are, because sometimes people overestimate, they underestimate, and we just want to say, this is what it costs in the real world, and this is what we're getting in return. I think sometimes the cost situation, which is always important, sometimes that cost can help determine what requirements that you need. So if you have a list of mandatory requirements and the budget doesn't match those requirements, then that's a way that you can kind of leverage more money, I would hope, for this system. Or for example, you have a system that you're finding that it has the mandatory requirements and some of the like nice to have requirements. If the cost of that system is too much, you can then decide on those nice to know requirements, what the ones that you don't need. And so that's a nice way of kind of having wiggle room, getting a sense of what something will cost. And then there's kind of a internal negotiation that happens to see what's actually possible. And, I should say when you talk about costs, it's always, and talking about money in general, it's always kind of a uncomfortable situation, but I think it's good to think through these things and really be really transparent about costs related to archival work and archives labor in general. So this is a long-term investment. So it's the same way of thinking about, the cost that you expel covers more than just the purchase price. It has licenses and support and other costs that are going to be in the long term. You want to think about the total cost of ownership. So what in the real world, what will this system cost? How long will we have it? How much value will it give us? And I wrote here on this last bullet point, initial costs and cost variations can shift perspective of overall value. And so that's a very long way of saying that, sometimes you buy a system or you have open source and it's low cost or free initially, and it seems to work in that time period. But as problems evolve, you realize, oh, we miscalculated. So that kind of initial value of, wow, this is a great system that we have and it's low cost. As troubles arise, that idea of value goes down. Whereas sometimes, people are thinking, okay, let's invest in this system, and they're not really sure about how it'll work. And if you get a successful system operating, you have people working with it, it's making things easier, it's automating things, it's pleasing donors, it's driving more visitors to your website, for example, there's more research requests, then that value builds over time and it might be slower to build. But it is perception of value, which I think is really important, especially with talking to the people in power within your organizations who might not quite understand the work that you do or the value that you give. So it's really important to always have a messaging of value of archives. So this is where you have some fun. So there's show and tell with formal demonstrations. So you have kind of a sense of maybe some systems you're interested in and want to kind of look beneath the hood. So you can arrange to have the vendors demonstrate their software. I would ask, you should ask them to preload some institutional data because you want to see what your data might look like in this system. And as you're going through the demonstration, you're keeping your requirements checklist nearby. So you're really being mindful of, what's happening in the demonstration, and you're making sure that you're getting all your questions answered. You're taking a lot of notes. I find sometimes the initial presentation is great. There's a lot of information, but there's just so much information to absorb. Sometimes it's helpful to have the demonstrations recorded to review later. I know that in time, a lot of people have more questions, like follow-up questions as they've thought about the systems more. So you want to capture those questions and have them answered. And then you also want to try some real-world scenarios. So thinking about like your top 3 activities of your archives, or the top 3 problems that you currently have with your system that you would love to have a more automated solution. Test them out and see what it looks like. See what it's like to create a finding aid, or to put something, enter information at the folder level. What does that actually look like in the real world? So before committing, of course, you want to ensure that your colleagues are pleased and they're prepared for the impact. So I think it's funny where it's like when you're preparing for this big change, your colleagues are probably aware of it. They've maybe sat in some meetings, they've had discussions, but then it's like, oh, we're really moving forward with with this solution. We've selected the collection management system that we want, and then it's like, okay, you have to kind of brace them for the impact of this new system. You want to read the contract carefully and ask questions and request changes. All contracts are a negotiation. You want to really make sure that you understand what is being asked of you, what you're signing on to. And then, of course, have your legal counsel review it. Make sure everyone is comfortable with signing on with the system. So you want to discover a system that suits your needs. So be an informed consumer. I think in these webinars, I've talked about really doing the research, really thinking about what you need, like really getting to know your workflows, your needs, how specifically your organization works, your colleagues, their skill levels, getting a real sense of the organization and having a real kind of navel gazing session on your organization. And then you can reach out for that right system. And you have that confidence that you're choosing the right thing because you've done all this internal research and thinking, and you know that this system is going to work for you. And so the system should, of course, oversee every facet of archival management that you need and should integrate well with other systems.
Margot, thank you for sharing not only your experience, but also your advice and knowledge around selecting collection management system. I know that is really important to our audience today. So even with all the value Margot provided for this webinar, sometimes they still surface more question than answer. So we do provide contacts here on this slide. You can email Margot if you have any more questions, Margot at margotnote.com. And you can also reach out to us if you'd like to know more about our solution as well. Our phone number is 604-278-6717, or you can send us an email, sales@lucidea.com. Again, thank you all for attending this very insightful and educational webinar. And we'll see you again for our next webinar series.